this is why, a lot of times people are taking the shortcuts. They don't have the knowledge, especially if you're getting into like a handyman situation or something like that. They don't have that knowledge on how to properly discontinue it. It's all. Hello, this is Stephen again with Service Plus Electrical. We have David here with Electrician Ed. This is our third video on the series on knob and tube wiring. So the first video we talked about knob and tube 101. What is it? What are the knobs? What are the tubes? How old is it? And it's quite old. The second video we talked about some pros and cons.
I lost you, Stephen.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first video we kind of just introduced to what is the knob and tube. What is the knob, the tube? It was installed a long time ago, basically one of the first wiring methods that we used. The second video we talked about the pros and cons. The only pro being that there's some good craftsmanship there. It kind of looks neat if you have the visual appreciation. The cons being, all sorts of things with heat, lack of heat dissipation, induction, which is the magnetic field around the wire, which creates extra heat and makes it less energy efficient. The lack of the grounding conductor, so we have only a 2-wire system, which creates shock scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this video, what we're going to talk about is kind of what is it like, what are the issues with altering the wiring, adding on to the knob and tube wiring, and what is it like to deal with, say, a partial upgrade of upgrading that wire. And so in that context, this is a situation that we see all the time where, when someone calls an electrician in, they typically want a receptacle for one particular thing. Maybe they have a new decorative lamp they want to put somewhere, so they want a new receptacle there. And that's really their focus, is they want that end result outcome. Well, if we go into that house and it has knob and tube wiring throughout, that becomes a different issue where, okay, do we want to tap onto that wiring or do we want to run a new circuit? I'll give you the short answer is we will always run a new circuit. Just that's our company policy. We don't tap onto the knob and tube. But we're going to get into a little bit of why that is. And so, David, some of the issues that we see the most with the knob and tube, it's some of our nastier looking photos that we collect and share on social media, is the places where people spliced into the knob and tube improperly. Mm-hmm. Because if you are going to do that, and it is allowed by code if it's done properly, correct?
I believe it's still allowed. Yeah.
It's one of those things that you don't really want to admit that it's allowed, and that's why it's just our policy not to do it. But if you are going to do it safely, there's so many things that have to be done to make sure it's safe. And there are not very many electricians that are trained in these things, which is a key point. Mm-hmm. So electricians are typically trained, how the modern wiring works, mm-hmm. how to run that wiring, and they're not trained on how to properly splice into knob and tube wiring.
Yeah.
And so let's say that someone is going to splice into that to add an outlet for a lamp or whatever the case may be. What kind of things do they have to do to make sure that that's safe?
Okay. Well, first of all, you need to look at your wiring, make sure that it's still in good shape. If it's cracked or crumbly in one place, it's probably like that in the rest of the places. When you're investigating that or having somebody do that, that's something they'll look at. Is this something that can safely be replaced or added onto? Can it be left in place? If it's crumbly in nature already, you really shouldn't do it at all. It should not be done. Now, somebody could still come along and do it. And what they're going to have to do is make sure that none of that insulation falls off that's on there already. They may have to tape it up. We are always going to put our splices into a box, but most of what we're going to run into are open splices that were originally part of the wiring method. And in some cases, I think one of the ones that Stephen showed earlier in the videos was a piece that had not been soldered. Did you show that one, or was that just to me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
there we
this
go.
here. This is where someone had spliced. So when we say splice, we just mean connecting a wire in.
Mhm.
They had spliced a newer wire into the older knob and tube. They wrapped the wire around and did not solder it, as you can see here.
Correct. The original wiring method required it to be soldered. And that looks like a T-splice. So they're actually adding onto that circuit for another load that they added down the road, or possibly that was part of the original, but it looks like those might be two separate types of conductors there that were tied together. So I'm
Yep.
thinking that was a later modification of that system.
Yes, that was an armored cable that was spliced into it.
Okay, so that means that that circuit is going to get a little bit hotter than it had been getting because now we've got more load on it. And that was still in the knob and tube era when that was done. Was that going to work? Yeah, that's electrically sound and it's going to pass current and everything like that, but that's still an open splice. And if anybody were to come up and touch that, they would be shocked probably, depending on which side that was in.
And so, yeah, to add to that, and this is the part that people don't usually see. This actually is done even better than most of what we see. And so most of what we see is somebody cuts the wire here, they cut the wire here, and they run a newer wire in between them and wire them together. We're lucky if we see a wire nut. A lot of times they'll just put them together and wrap tape around it. That's a very bad situation because not only are you adding more to the electrical load, causing more heat to that old wiring, you now have a spot where those two wires are not really connected properly. And if they have any separation, this can change in temperature, can cause this. Then
Very
there's little
quickly.
sparks that happen.
Yes, and that heats up very fast. That'll start a flame almost instantly
Mhm.
in some cases.
And so this is why we're getting into this discussion with what is it like when you alter the wiring and when you add on to the wiring is someone can definitely come into your old house with knob and tube wiring. They can add the outlet. So that way you can, plug your television in, say, in a new location, and it will work. They'll plug the television in, it will work. Everything seems to be great on the surface, but in the attic tells a different story. And this is why you really want to get like some before and after pictures of the things you don't see. But there's other factors as well, such as, like we mentioned, there's often not an electrical box because if you put it in a box like we are supposed to today, then there's a couple extra steps that have to be done to do that knob and tube in a box properly. And David, can you go over what those are? I have an example for when you get to it.
Okay, well, there's two different types of boxes, metal or non-metallic. We're, I guess if you don't have now we're talking about putting a new circuit in the attic to tie onto that. Yet,
Yeah,
have we
or
gotten to that point yet?
even just putting the knob and tube in a box to say connect to fix a bad connection. You still have a little bit of extra steps that you have to take as far as separating the two wires, make sure they go into separate holes in the box. There's a
Correct.
protective sleeve here, especially if there's a metal box. This sleeve that goes around it is another protection so that wire doesn't get scraped.
Okay. Yeah. So originally they didn't require boxes and it just came directly through the wall like Stephen had showed before, and into the fixture. or into a receptacle. Nowadays, if you do it according to code, a box is required at those locations. The two separate conductors come through their own separate holes. The holes are supposed to be bushed. If it's a non-conductive box, then that's not quite as important because it's not metal on insulation there.
Mm-hmm.
Probably still a good idea. Bushed just means that it's got some kind of an extra bushing, little smoother, a little less aggressive, I guess. And then the tubes, the flexible tubes, they're supposed to actually come into the box and clamp to the box, clamp inside the box. Excuse me. Edit that out, Stephen. So then the conductors come through. We've got to have it like 6 inches of free conductor inside of a box. So sometimes that's not possible with the way some electricians do their wiring or did their wiring back then. You don't have enough material left there anymore to do that, but you're supposed to have 6 inches of free conductor. That's the part beyond where it emerges into the box and where it comes out should be about 6 inches, depending on the size of the box. But in most cases, residential device boxes. And that's just so you have enough room to splice or to splice or to add on to your device, like your switch or your receptacle.
Right. And so just to give an example of that, if we come in, this is something that we see it all the time. So somebody wants to update their light fixture. Very simple to do to make the light turn on and make everything look pretty. Someone can come in and as we said, there's no box. There's no electrical box. So you have the two wires coming in like we showed. I'll go ahead and share my screen again real quick. But we have the two wires that come in, through the plaster, or for example, this one's a little patched up better. Here's your two wires. But it's really easy to get that light working, but there's a lot that has to go on there. And so someone can get that light working pretty cheaply. But if we go and replace a light fixture on the knob and tube wiring, we're going to install electrical box, which means that we then, we'll usually have to chip away some of the plaster. We'll put that box in there. And when David's mentioning that bushing protection as it comes into the box, that's what this sleeve is for. And I can pull this off. It's not connected to anything, but the wire passes through here where it goes into the box, and there's a clamp that holds that down because we don't want the wire to pull out and make extra pressure on the connections. And so we want it to be secured in the box. All of this stuff that we're saying is merely to say there are a lot of factors to making it safe if you're going to use that. And there's not a lot of electricians that are trained in those things. There's not a lot of electricians that understand electricity very well. It's kind of a sad situation, which David and myself in different ways we're trying to do something about that to help that become a different scenario. And so if you call Service Plus and you want a receptacle added for something and your entire house is knob and tube wiring, our policy is we'll replace the light fixture or we'll replace the outlet if all the wiring's right there. We're not going to tap onto any knob and tube and add additional wiring. So we're not going to add 20 feet of wire to put a receptacle somewhere else. If that's the case, we're going to run a brand new circuit. Even if that's the smallest thing, a television or something like that, we're going to recommend that we run a brand new circuit, which has all of the new protections, arc fault protection, ground fault protection, if it applies. And we'll put a nice junction box in your attic, or we'll put a junction box in the basement. That way, for the next down the line, when you want to add a ceiling fan or you want to add something else in a different location, we have a nice clean circuit that's not adding additional load to that old wiring. And and we have something to tap off to that we know is a solid, safe circuit. And so really that's the point of this video is, yeah, there's just so many factors to consider, honestly. And we should talk about this too, because sometimes it comes into play. We'll get in more to the budget on the next video. Once someone becomes aware that this is important, and there's different ways that comes about, but this is where they start looking at, replacing the knob and tube. Ideally, we'll replace the whole system, which we'll discuss in the next video. But sometimes the budget or other factors dictate that, we can only do this piecemeal. We can only do certain things at a time. And so often we'll give them that option of, okay, let's start with these 2 rooms, for example. And even that has a lot of special care that has to be taken in order to make sure it's done properly. So we're not tearing out all of the old wiring in the home. We're leaving some of it for certain areas, but we want to disconnect the parts which we're going to be rewiring. Can you talk a little bit on what that's like? How do you disconnect certain parts of the circuit safely? And how do you know that you're not disconnecting something and leaving like a live wire inside the wall or something like that?
That's a trick, but yes, sometimes that's the decision to keep some of the knob and tube, and it's usually, wherever it's not accessible anymore, and you can't easily fish wire down to it, because you may save a tiny bit of money in the cost because of materials, but let's say that you're going to do that. You're going to leave some of the knob and tube wiring. What you'll do is you'll go to the last few accessible inches that you have, let's say to the last support, which would be a knob usually, and you're going to turn that circuit off, obviously, cut the conductors and bring them both over to a place where you can put a box. You're probably going to want to put flexible tubing back to that last support. Bring those conductors into the box. You mount that box somewhere accessible. Bring them each in through their own separate hole. Clamp them. If it's a metal box, when you bring your new circuit up, let's say Romex with the ground, it's going to come in through its own hole, and you'll bond the box. Now the new wiring that comes from your panel will be grounded. That has to be, and that's a given. If it's a metal box, it's going to be bonded to that grounding system. So if there's anything that happens in the splices, you're not going to be able to touch that box and get shocked. I've done that in an attic before. The box was not bonded, and there was one wire that had come out of its wire nut, was electrifying the entire box. And that was that was no fun. Anyway, your box is not going to be a danger. The box is going to protect the splicing and everything that that is kind of laid bare there. One of the problems that we have with the old knob and tube wiring is, even if it's in good condition, when you go to fold it back into the box, the electricians are going to have to make sure that that doesn't crack apart right there at that fold, or maybe in several places sometimes, just to get it to fold into the box neatly, because you still have to have your 6 inches sticking out. So we're going to make a splice, we're going to fold it back in, and we're going to put a cover on it.
Yeah, so if you caught any of that David said, the whole point that we're trying to get across, there's a lot that goes into making sure that this is safe, even if we're just discontinuing a portion of it. And so we will give those options where we say, we'll we'll run new wire to one room or two rooms, or sometimes it's even just if someone is plugging in a space heater or something like a high load appliance, then we'll say, yeah, that thing needs its own circuit, right? So we'll run a new circuit to it. And sometimes if we're doing an entire room, we have to discontinue those things properly. If you heard all of that, it's a lot of extra work. It's a lot of extra care. It's a lot of extra knowledge to even do that safely. And so this is why, a lot of times people are taking the shortcuts. They don't have the knowledge, especially if you're getting into like a handyman situation or something like that. They don't have that knowledge on how to properly discontinue it.
Mhm.
It's a lot of extra
Yeah,
work, takes extra time.
I mean, it's not terribly common, but I have seen where people have used a yellow Romex wire. They brought up a new circuit, but they just tapped right into the knob and tube method, open splice. You see that kind of stuff occasionally.
Yeah, and we see it more than David.
It's yeah, it's really important that you get a qualified electrical contractor. Um, People will say that they can do electrical, they're your neighbor, they're your handyman, but are they licensed? How much experience do they have? Do they really know the codes? I can't stress that enough. This is life safety. This is the safety of your family on the line.
Mm-hmm.
And and I've just run into so much stuff that other people, I won't name names because there's too many to name for one thing, probably.
Right.
And a lot of times I have no idea, but I've followed other people's work before and it's not safe. Make sure that you get somebody that's qualified.
Couldn't say that enough times. And
Yep.
there's definitely one other thing that we need to touch on really quick. This isn't an electrician realm, but if there's a knob and tube in your attic, in your wall, you do not add insulation into that
Mm.
area. This is a huge problem. This is one of the biggest problems is, you have a really old house and it's not efficient on the heating and air. You can put a whole new system in there and it's not as efficient because you don't have the insulation. You cannot insulate where there's knob and tube wiring because of that,
Mm.
what we mentioned in one of the earlier videos of that heat dissipation. It has to be in the open air to dissipate that heat. And if you pour insulation on top of that, that is a very, very
Yeah.
big problem.
You'll smother the wires in their own heat then.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So I think we had a good run at that. In the last video, we're going to go over kind of factors to consider when you're upgrading it completely, and that'll kind of round off our series. If you have more questions, I'm sure there's going to be more questions. So we're hoping that this is really helpful information to people. If you have more questions, send them our way, and we can circle back and get more in depth into certain specific things as we need it. But we'll see you on the next video where we talk about the complete upgrade of knob and tube wiring. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve.